for tonight, Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thanks very much. First question always is, can you hear me? Yes, okay. Rare response, it's usually no. Perhaps it's a sign of my age, perhaps something else, but I can't help thinking more and more of the world that we are bequeathing to our children and grandchildren. And it's not a pretty picture, not one that should inspire pride. There are several grim shadows that hover menacingly over thoughts about our legacy. Two are dominant because they literally reach as far as species survival, at least survival in any decent form. Those are nuclear war and environmental disaster. Not only is nothing serious being done about them, but actually current decisions are increasing the threats. Just to give one of innumerable examples, a couple of weeks ago, a high-level international scientific study was released. It estimated that within the next 20 years, 100 million people will die from the effects of climate change, mostly in the poorer countries. In the US, there was scarcely a mention, not one in the mainstream media. In fact, the reactions are illustrated by a recent report on the acceleration of Arctic ice melting. The reaction is to plan to exploit the newly exposed resources to increase the use of fossil fuels, that is, to accelerate the catastrophe. Reactions such as these, and it's easy to go on, demonstrate an extraordinary willingness to sacrifice the lives of our children and our grandchildren for short-term gain, or perhaps an equally remarkable willingness to shut our eyes so as not to see impending peril the way an infant sometimes does. As for the threat of nuclear war, it's on the front pages daily, but in a way that would seem outlandish to an independent observer viewing the strange doings on Earth. The major current threat, not for the first time, is in the Middle East. The general picture in the West, clear and straightforward. It's far too dangerous to allow Iran to reach nuclear capability. That is, the capability enjoyed by numerous powers to produce nuclear weapons if they decide to do so. As to whether they've decided to do so, U.S. intelligence, the most knowledgeable source, tells us that it doesn't know. The International Atomic Energy Agency had a recent report a few weeks ago, and it concludes, and I'll quote it, "It cannot demonstrate the absence of undeclared nuclear material and activities in Iran." That's true. It's a condition that can't possibly be satisfied conveniently. So therefore, Iran must be denied the right to enrich uranium that's guaranteed by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which, of course, it's a signer. Well, that's the general picture in the West. I stress in the West, not in the world. We saw that recently in the meetings of the non-aligned movement in Tehran. That's most of the world, in fact, though they're not called part of the international community. It's a technical term of political science that refers to the United States and whoever happens to be going along with it. At the non-aligned movement, once again, as before, they vigorously reaffirmed Iran's right to enrich uranium as a member of the NPT and condemned the sanctions and so on. There's interesting reactions in the Arab world that I'll return to. The basic concern, the basic reason for concern has been stated succinctly by General Lee Butler. He's the former head of the U.S. Strategic Command, the military institution that's responsible for nuclear weapons planning, and so on. He writes that it is dangerous in the extreme that in the cauldron of animosities that we call the Middle East, one nation should arm itself with nuclear weapons, which may inspire other nations to do so. General Butler, however, is not referring to Iran, but as you may have guessed, he's referring to Israel. That's the country that ranks highest in European polls as the most dangerous country in the world, right above Iran. The Arab world is different. There also Israel ranks highest as the most dangerous country, and the United States is right behind it as the second most dangerous. Iran, according to Western polls, is generally disliked, but not considered much of a threat among the populations, that is, and not the dictatorships. The Western media and commentary keep almost entirely to the views of the dictators, and so we hear regularly that the Arabs want decisive action against Iran. The populations don't, but it's only the dictators who count according to Western conceptions of democracy. Actually, that reflects the one of many examples reflecting the deep contempt for democracy and fear of democracy in elite Western opinion. It's a matter highly relevant to the Arab Spring. I'll return to that. Well, unlike Iran, Israel refuses to allow inspections or to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has hundreds of nuclear weapons, advanced delivery systems, also a long record of violence and repression, which I presume it's unnecessary to review. Meanwhile, severe threats of attack continue from the United States and particularly Israel. Maybe some of you have antiquarian interests. If there are any, you may remember a document called the United Nations Charter, which is theoretically the foundation of modern international law. It has an explicit provision banning the threat or use of force in international affairs. Every time a U.S. president opens his mouth on this topic or someone writes an article, they're violating the UN Charter, if anybody cares. There happen to be two rogue states which disregard international law and are powerful enough to get away with it. The United States, of course, and Israel, as long as it's protected by the United States or anyone else who's protected by the world superpower. Actually, the European Union goes along with this. Well, the threats are not just words. There is an ongoing war. It includes assassinations, what we'd call international terrorism if anyone else was doing it, economic warfare, which is a form of war. U.S. threats have cut Iran out of the international financial system. Other countries are afraid to stand up to the dangerous bully who runs things. 5 former NATO commanders recently released a new grand strategy, which they called it, which identified weapons of finance as acts of war that justify military response when directed against us, that is. Cutting Iran out of global financial markets is a different matter. The U.S. is openly engaged, in fact, with much self-praise in cyber war, large-scale cyber war against Iran. The U.S. Pentagon identifies cyber war as a form of military aggression which justifies a military response, but again, against us. Israel's lethal armory includes advanced submarines, just provided by Germany, new ones in recent months, which are capable of carrying Israel's nuclear-tipped missiles. These are sure to be deployed in the Gulf or nearby, may already be, if Israel proceeds with its threats to bomb Iran, or more likely to try to set up conditions in which the United States will do so. And the United States, of course, has a vast array of nuclear weapons throughout the region, as throughout the world. For the region, it ranges from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, including enough firepower in the Gulf to destroy most of the world. Another story in the news right now is the Israeli bombing of the Osirak reactor in Iraq in 1981. That's now presented as a model for Israeli bombing of Iran. It's rarely mentioned that the bombing of the Osirak reactor did not end Iraq's nuclear weapons program. It initiated it. That reactor was not capable of producing nuclear materials, but as soon as it was bombed, Saddam Hussein initiated a program of nuclear weapons development, which got pretty far. I might add that the United States helped with that. In 1989, after the Iran-Iraq war was over, the first President Bush, the good one, invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production. Well, that's not mentioned either. If indeed there is a bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities, one of the consequences, among a lot of other horrible ones that one can think of, is that they're very likely to react exactly the way Saddam Hussein did. Too much talking in the last week. Right now, we should be thinking about the 50th anniversary of what has been called the most dangerous moment in human history. Those are the words of historian and Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger. He's referring to the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The specific day that was the most dangerous moment happened to be October 27th. We're coming close to the exact 50th anniversary. At that point, Kennedy had raised the nuclear alert to the highest level, short of actual launch. He had authorized NATO aircraft, mostly US, but others too, Turkish pilots and so on. They were authorized to fly to Moscow and bomb, setting off a likely nuclear conflagration. The regulations were so lax that individual pilots could have made that decision on their own in the huge bomber fleet that was in the air, US bomber fleet, about a third of the total B-52 fleet flying right around Russia. with individual jet pilots carrying 15 bombs, each of them Hiroshima-level nuclear bombs, and with authorization to launch them if they felt like doing it. At the peak of the crisis, October 27th, Kennedy estimated the probability of nuclear war at perhaps 50%. It's a war that would have destroyed the Northern Hemisphere, President Eisenhower had warned. Facing the risk of destruction, if not suicide, Kennedy refused to agree publicly to an offer by Russian Premier Khrushchev to end the crisis by simultaneous withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba and US missiles from Turkey on Russia's border. These, incidentally, were obsolete missiles which were already being replaced by invulnerable Polaris submarines in the Mediterranean. But Kennedy refused. It was felt necessary to establish the principle that that Russia has no right to have any offensive weapons anywhere outside its territory, while the United States must have the unilateral right to have them all over the world, on the borders of Russia, targeting Russia or China or any other enemy, perceived enemy. In fact, just a few months before the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out, the United States had secretly deployed nuclear missiles in Okinawa, aimed at China at a moment of elevated regional tensions there. Well, fortunately, Khrushchev backed down, or we wouldn't be having this meeting today. But the world can't be assured of such sanity forever. Particularly threatening is the fact that intellectual opinion and even scholarship hail Kennedy's achievement as his finest hour and a model of crisis management and how to proceed with similar crises in the future. 10 years later, during the 1973 Israel-Arab War, Henry Kissinger called a high-level nuclear alert to warn the Russians not to interfere, while he was secretly informing Israel that they could violate the ceasefire that the United States and Israel had imposed. We just learned about that. When Ronald Reagan came into office a few years later, the United States launched operations probing Russian defenses and simulating air and naval attacks on Russia, while at the same time placing Pershing missiles in Germany that had a 5-minute flight time to Moscow. They provided what the CIA called a super sudden first strike capability. Well, the Russians were deeply concerned, not surprisingly. They thought these things might be an attack. And that actually led to a major war scare in 1983, which again could have wiped us all out. There have been hundreds of cases of when human intervention aborted a first strike minutes before launch. The automated response systems give a warning of an attack, and there's a few minutes for direct human intervention. We know of hundreds of such cases in the United States. We don't have Russian records, but it's almost certain that their systems are far more accident-prone, so we have no idea how many times this has happened with their systems. In fact, it's a near miracle that nuclear war has so far been averted. Meanwhile, India and Pakistan have come close to nuclear war several times. The crises that sparked this remain. Both India and Pakistan have refused to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty along with Israel, and have received US support for the development of their nuclear weapons programs. That's until today, in the case of India, which has now become a U.S. ally. War threats in the Middle East, which might become reality very soon, once again escalate the dangers. Well, within the Middle East, there's a very straightforward way to mitigate or perhaps end whatever threat Iran is alleged to pose. That is to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. And that opportunity, which has been alive for a long time, is coming again in just a few months. There's to be an international conference in Finland on moving ahead with this plan. It has overwhelming international support, including, incidentally, a majority of public opinion in Israel. It's been forcefully advanced by Egypt since 1995. So far, it's been blocked by the United States, which insists that Israel be excluded, most recently by President Obama, who added that condition to any such move. Unless there's large-scale public pressure in the United States, it's very unlikely that anything will be done. And there can't be large-scale public pressure for the simple reason that almost no one even knows about it. The media don't mention it, period. You can read about it in specialized arms-controlled journals. There's dissident writers. I write about it, a couple of others. But it doesn't reach the public, so there can't be any protest. That's an important illustration of a much more general point, the limits of freedom in practice in societies in which popular struggle over a long period has reached a high level of freedom in principle, more so in the United States than anywhere else, which I presume is one of the reasons why the techniques of suppression are more sophisticated. There's more freedom, can't take chances. Well, let's put these grim prospects aside and turn to how the current world system developed since World War II, the modern period, how it's changed over the years, and where things stand today, and then where the Arab Spring fits into this. There is a common theme in the foreign policy and political science literature. Actually, I'll quote from the U.S. Academy of Political Science, recent issue, the theme that only a few years ago, America was hailed to stride the world as a colossus with unparalleled power and unmatched appeal, but it is now in decline, ominously facing the prospects of its final decay. There's a recent issue of the major establishment Journal of International Relations and Foreign Affairs, which has on the front cover, big black letters, the title of the issue. The title is America Over? The themes are widely believed, and with some reason, though a number of qualifications, crucial qualifications, are in order. The decline is real, but it's not recent. It's been going on since World War II. At the end of World War II, the United States reached the height of its power, actually a level of power without any precedent in world history. The United States had, well, I'll come back to it. There's a commonly drawn corollary to the American decline that powers shifting to China and India, that's highly dubious. These are poor countries, severe internal problems. The world is certainly becoming more diverse, but despite America's decline, which is real, in the foreseeable future, there's no competitor for global hegemonic power. It'll stay that way for quite some time to come. Just to keep to one dimension alone, and not the only one, military power, The U.S. military spending is approximately equal to the rest of the world combined. Technologically, the U.S. military is far more advanced. The United States is alone in saturating the world with military bases, maybe 1,000 of them. Another indication is the recently announced figures on global arms sales. The U.S. holds more than 3/4 of the global market. Sales are more than 10 times as high as the second-place country, Russia, and military dimension is only one of many. Well, going back to the beginning of the contemporary era, peak of U.S. power, during World War II, the war itself greatly strengthened the United States economically and militarily. The government stimulus ended the Depression. Industrial production quadrupled practically. Other industrial powers were severely damaged or destroyed even before of the war. In fact, 50 years before, the United States had been by far the richest power in the world, but not a major player in world affairs. It was understood by Washington planners, President Roosevelt's planners, during the war, that the United States would emerge in a position of overwhelming power. It's quite clear from the documentary record that, quote, President Roosevelt was aiming at United States hegemony in the post-war world. That's the accurate conclusion of leading British diplomatic historian Geoffrey Warner, one of the leading specialists on this topic. And plans were developed to control most of the world, to control what was called a grand area. The grand area would include, as a minimum, Western Hemisphere, it's taken for granted, all of the Far East, the former British Empire, which of course includes the crucial Middle East oil reserves, and also as much of Eurasia as possible, crucially its most advanced industrial commercial regions in Western Europe. And within these expansive domains, to quote the documents, the United States was to maintain unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy while ensuring the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might interfere with its global designs. Those doctrines, incidentally, still prevail, but the capacity to implement them has reduced. And the plans were not unrealistic for the reasons I mentioned. The United States had about half the world's total wealth, unmatched security. The ensuing Cold War consisted overwhelmingly of efforts by the two superpowers to enforce order in their own domains. For Russia, that meant Eastern Europe, the traditional invasion corridor. For the United States, it meant most of the rest of the world. Well, that was 1945 and the ensuing Cold War. Very quickly, the grand area began to erode. The first blow, and a very serious one, was in 1949. That's called the loss of China. China became independent, pulled out of the grand area. That had severe domestic repercussions internally to the United States. Numerous accusations about blame for the loss of China. That continues until today. Actually, the phrase itself is kind of interesting, the loss of China. You can only lose something that you possess, right? Like, I can't lose your computer. I can lose my computer. But it's just taken for granted that the United States owns the world. So if China moved to independence, we lost China. And then comes the question, who's to blame for that loss? Well, shortly after, it seemed that we might also lose Southeast Asia. That led to Washington's horrendous Indochina wars, and also the huge massacres in Indonesia in 1965 as U.S. dominance was restored. Meanwhile, subversion and massive violence continued elsewhere in the effort to retain what's called stability, which another technical term, which means conformity to U.S. demands. Despite this, decline was inevitable as the industrial world reconstructed after the war and decolonization pursued its agonizing course. By 1970, the U.S. share of world wealth had declined to about 25%, still colossal, but not 50%. It remains at roughly that level. The industrial world by then had become what's called tripolar, three major centers. One US-based North America, the other German-based Europe, and the third Asia, then Japan-based, already by 1970 becoming the most dynamic growth region in the industrial world. 20 years after that, the Soviet Union collapsed. And for those who want to understand the reality of the Cold War, it's highly informative to look closely at what happened when it ended. It tells us quite a lot about what it was about. At that time, the first Bush administration was in office. It immediately declared officially that policies would remain pretty much unchanged, but with different pretexts. So the large, huge, in fact, military establishment would be retained, but not for defense against the Russians, they were gone, rather to confront what they called the technological sophistication of third world powers. Now, if you're a well-educated intellectual, you don't laugh when you hear that, and nobody laughed. It was also necessary to maintain what they called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism that refers to high-tech industry, which is heavily dependent on state subsidy, largely through the Pentagon funnel. Easy way to do it. The most interesting case was the intervention forces, which were established by President Carter, aimed at the Middle East. There, the new plans stated, I'm quoting them, our serious problems could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. The reason for the intervention forces had never been the Russians. That's contrary to 50 years of deceit, but clouds had lifted. Can't appeal to that anymore. With the Russians gone, it was conceded that the threat had always been what's called radical nationalism, that is, attempts by countries to pursue an independent course in violation of grand area principles. Actually, that lesson generalizes worldwide, as easily demonstrated. One very instructive case is NATO. As you know, NATO was established in order to defend Western Europe against the rampaging Russian hordes. Okay, 1989, no more Russian hordes. So if you believe received doctrine, NATO should have been reduced or eliminated. That's not what happened. NATO expanded. It expanded to the east in violation of explicit promises to Russian Premier Gorbachev. Gorbachev agreed to allow a unified Germany as part of a Western military system that's quite an astonishing concession if you think about the history of the century. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia several times in the century. Now he was agreeing to a unified, remilitarized Germany and inside a bigger military alliance. But he insisted on a quid pro quo. He insisted on a guarantee that NATO would not expand to the east. He was particularly concerned with East Germany. Nobody dreamed of an expansion beyond. And he got the promise. The promise was that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase. Immediately, NATO expanded to East Germany. Gorbachev was kind of outraged, but when he protested, President Bush and James Baker, Secretary of State, pointed out to him that it was just a gentleman's agreement. They had never put it down in writing. And if he was naive enough to believe a gentleman's agreement, his problem. So NATO is, the internal records have all been released on this. They're quite interesting to read. So NATO expanded to East Germany, then Clinton expanded it farther to the east. By now, NATO has become a global intervention force under U.S. command, which has an official mission. The official mission is to control the international energy system, sea lanes and pipelines anywhere, and in fact to do whatever the hegemonic power determines. Well, I'll leave the rest to you, but if you think it through, all of these things tell us quite a lot about the reality of the Cold War. I presume that's the reason why they're almost totally ignored in scholarship. You can check pretty easily if you like. But the data, the documents are there, they're very clear and explicit, and I don't think I have to spell out what they mean. Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a period of euphoria with excited tales about the end of history, awed acclaim for Clinton's foreign policy, which had entered a noble phase with a saintly glow, as for the first time in history, a nation is guided by altruism alone, dedicated to principles and values, and nothing now stood in the way of the idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity could at last carry forward unhindered the emerging norm of humanitarian intervention. Those are quotes. That's a small sample from the inspired rhetoric of the most prominent intellectuals in the United States and Europe. Well, not everyone was so enraptured. The traditional victims, the global South, had quite a different view. They bitterly condemned what they called the so-called right of humanitarian intervention, recognizing it as just the old right of imperial domination. But their voices are easily ignored, in fact, not mentioned. They are what George Orwell called unpeople, not people, so we don't have to listen to them. After Bush II took over, second Bush, it became increasingly, it became pretty difficult to ignore hostile world opinion. In the Arab world particularly, Bush's approval ratings plummeted. And one of Obama's most impressive feats is that he's been able to sink even lower than Bush, which is quite a trick. Got to give him credit for that. Well, meanwhile, the decline continued. In the past decade, something extremely important happened. South America has been lost. That's serious. That's after 500 years of imperial domination. And what happened is it pulled itself out. Steps towards integration, towards independence, kicking out all U.S. military bases. Not trivial. That was always considered the safe, secure backyard that we didn't have to worry about. Well, that was serious enough, but far more serious would be moves towards independence in the Middle East. Planners in the 1940s recognized that control of the incomparable energy resources of the Middle East would yield substantial control of the world, words of an influential Roosevelt advisor. And correspondingly, a loss of control would threaten the global dominance that was clearly articulated during World War II and has been sustained since that day in the face of major changes in world order. Now, the important word there is control. It's often misunderstood. That's what has dominated the U.S. policy towards the oil-producing regions. Control, not access. If the U.S. was on 100% solar power, it would have the same policies towards the Middle East. In fact, in the 1950s and 60s, it wasn't relying at all on Middle East oil, but had the same policies. Even more striking, in 1958, the U.S. government decided to exhaust domestic supplies instead of using cheap Saudi oil in order to benefit Texas oil producers to enrich them. So the U.S. used domestic resources, leaving big holes in the ground, which are now called the strategic reserve, filled from oil overseas. That went on till the Nixon years. It's not access, it's control that matters. There's one illustration of that, which is of great contemporary import. It's revealed in an important recent study just coming out of the 1953 US-UK coup that overthrew the parliamentary regime in Iran, consequences that reverberate right to the present very obviously. This study is by a very fine Iran scholar, Ervan Abrahamian, very much worth reading. He shows very convincingly that standard accounts of the coup just can't be sustained. The primary causes were not Cold War concerns, contrary to claims. They weren't Iranian irrationality that undermined Washington's benign intentions. And rather strikingly, the concerns were not access to Iran's oil, rather control over the oil, what the official documents call overall controls. That's what had to be maintained, which has broader implications for global dominance, which is threatened by independent nationalism. That's always been the primary concern, still is. A further danger in the Middle East is that it might move towards meaningful democracy, and that is a very serious threat, and it's easy to see why. There are many studies of Arab public opinion by leading U.S. polling agencies, scholarly studies by polling agencies, and they give pretty much the same results. The United States surely does not want policies in the Arab countries, in Egypt and elsewhere, which will reflect public opinion. That is, policies which will perceive Israel and the United States as the major threats, won't perceive Iran as much of a threat, and where considerable numbers, sometimes large majorities, think the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons to offset U.S. power. Obviously, that's not what the U.S. and its allies want to be Egyptian policy, or policy of other countries. So therefore, the democracy has got to be stopped. Democracy means, if it means anything, it means that public opinion is reflected in policy. For the West, the most important states are the dictatorships, of course, the oil dictatorships, and they've been okay. They're democratic uprisings have taken place, but they were ruthlessly crushed with Western support and tolerance. So they're in good shape. Elsewhere, the major structures of the former dictatorships, including Egypt, have remained substantially intact, though they're threatened by popular forces. I don't have to tell you about that, which is a very serious concern in the West. That's why Obama and his allies strongly supported the dictators in 2011, France and Tunisia, Obama and Hillary Clinton in Egypt, did as long as it was possible, till it was totally impossible to support them anymore. The army had turned against them, then try to reconstruct the former system. Well, fear of democracy is demonstrated very dramatically over and over, but it doesn't interfere with the impressive rhetoric about what's sometimes called our yearning for democracy. Actually, there can't be an example more clear than right on the borders of Egypt. The 2006 election in Palestine was the first real free election in the Arab world. It was declared free and fair by independent observers. The US and Israel did try hard to interfere with it, to swing it to their favored candidates, but it didn't work. The election came out the wrong way. Instantly, within days, the US and Israel, followed obediently by the European Union, turned to punishing the population for violating democracy by voting in the way they chose, not the way we chose. That's not democracy. The US then turned immediately to the routine procedure for overthrowing a democratic government where the people don't understand how to vote, began planning for a military coup to be led by Mahmoud Dahlan. The elected government preempted the coup in 2007, beat it back. That's an even worse crime. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election. It's even worse to deter a US-planned military coup to restore the government that was voted down. And the reaction was to escalate the punishment of the population even more sharply, with consequences that you know about. I won't run through them. And that continues to the present. This demonstrates with remarkable clarity the Western attitudes towards democracy. It's fine when it comes out the way we say, period. And it's kind of interesting that this cannot be perceived. It's incidentally by no means the only example. Actually, that conclusion has been demonstrated by the most respected and quite conservative US scholarship. I could give you the details if you're interested. It's found that to the present, the United States supports democracy if and only if it accords with strategic and economic interests. That's not very surprising, nor is it surprising that the very well-established conclusions are ignored and don't interfere at all with the favorite doctrinal dogmas about our yearning for democracy and so on. Of course, none of this is unique to the United States. Well, control of the Middle East remains largely intact for the moment. Nevertheless, it's threatened. That's up to you. American decline nevertheless continues in other dimensions. And quite significantly, the decline is in significant part self-inflicted. There's a recent study by the Economic Policy Institute in Washington. That's the major source of reliable, regular information and analysis of the economy, a lot of data on the economy. The recent study of theirs is called Failure by Design. It reviews the data on the impact of the neoliberal policies of the past generation, which are very familiar to you. They're the same as those elsewhere, including Egypt. That includes a remarkable concentration of wealth, while wages have stagnated or declined. Working hours have increased well beyond Europe, and the weak benefit system has eroded. Standard features of neoliberal policies, sometimes called structural adjustment. The authors point out that the failure that they talk about is class-based. The designers have done wonderfully. They've achieved spectacular success, again, familiar. And they also stress that it's by design. Alternative policies always were possible, still are. And again, I point out that all of this should be entirely familiar to all of you right here. Corporate power, which is now mostly financial capital, has become so influential in the political system that by now both parties are well to the right of the population on major issues. That's why issues are largely excluded from the presidential campaigns, as you may have noticed if you've been following it. There are careful studies by mainstream political scientists which make it clear that in the collapsing political system, the very rich generally gain what they want, while the general public, that's independent of what the public may prefer. Actually, the most detailed study by political scientist Martin Gillen's just appeared. It shows that for about 70% of the population are powerless to shape government policy. That means they're effectively disenfranchised. And then as you move up the wealth level, you get a little more influence. When you get to the very top, you get what you want. The mechanisms are pretty clear. It's important to point out, however, that by comparison with Europe, the United States is somewhat progressive in this respect. The central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve, it's heavily influenced by financial corporations, but it's pretty progressive in comparison with its European counterpart, the European Central Bank, the ECB. The US Fed is committed by law to two policies, two tasks. The first is reducing unemployment, and the second is to keep inflation from exploding. Now that concern is non-existent, but the former one, maintaining employment, receives at least some attention by the Fed. In contrast, the ECB has only one commitment, keep inflation down for the benefit of bankers, primarily the Bundesbank. That provides a very welcome opportunity, which is now being exploited in Europe, to dismantle the welfare state, one of Europe's great contributions to modern civilization. And that's understood. That's what we're seeing before our eyes. The president of the ECB, Mario Draghi, knew exactly what he was talking about when he informed the Wall Street Journal a few months ago that the continent's traditional social contract is obsolete, not for any intrinsic reasons, but by design. Well, the self-inflicted blows in the United States, as in much of the West, are not a recent phenomenon. They go back to the 1970s, when the political economy underwent major transformations. The process expanded rapidly under Reagan and Thatcher. It's one component of the general and neoliberal assault on the populations of much of the world. Egypt didn't escape, had severe impact everywhere, pretty much everywhere, and pretty much the same structure. Well, there's no time here to run through the process, to different forms and different societies, but with a great many structural similarities. The outcome is pretty clear, and sometimes it's clearly described. It's very well described in a brochure for investors that was put out a couple of years ago by Citigroup, one of the huge banking conglomerates. It's once again being rescued by the U.S. taxpayer, as it has been regularly since the Reagan years. There's a cycle of risky loans, huge profits, bailout by the taxpayer. The head of the British, one of the heads of the British banking system calls this a doom cycle that we're committed to, deeply committed to. The bank's analysts describe a world that's divided into two blocks. One of them they call the plutonomy, the very rich. The second block is everyone else. They are sometimes called the global precariat, those who live a precarious existence, whether or not they're lucky enough to have a job. In the United States, they're subjected to what's called growing worker insecurity. That's the basis for a healthy economy. Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan testified to Congress while he was lauding his great performance in economic management. That's the real shift in global society. It's not to China and India, it's to the global plutonomy, mostly centered in the United States, Britain, other rich societies, but with pieces of it everywhere. You can see them right here, and same in sub-Saharan Africa, everywhere else. There's a slice that's part of the plutonomy, the rest are the precariat. The Citigroup, this is an investment brochure, so they advise investors to focus on the very rich. That's where the action is. They have what they call a plutonomy stock basket, investments and things that the rich need, elegant jewelry and things like that. And they point out that the plutonomy stock index has greatly outperformed the world index of developed markets since 1985. That's when the Reagan-Thatcher economic programs of enriching the very wealthy and punishing the rest were really taking off in the rich countries, but of course with much greater harm in the poorer countries. Well, before the 2007 crash, for which incidentally they were largely responsible, the financial institutions of the neoliberal failure by design era had gained startling economic power. They had more than tripled their share of corporate profits. It was up to 40% of total corporate profits in the United States. After the crash, finally, a number of economists began to inquire into their function in just purely economic terms, something that had rarely been done before, which is quite interesting. One of them was Nobel laureate in economics, his colleague of mine, Robert Solow. He concluded that the general impact of the financial corporations is probably negative, quote him. The successes probably add little or nothing to the efficiency of the real economy, while the disasters, which are periodic and growing, transfer wealth from taxpayers to financiers. The most respected financial correspondent in the English-speaking world is surely Martin Wolf of the London Financial Times. He took a much stronger stance. I'll quote him. The out-of-control financial sector is eating out the modern market economy from inside, just as the larva of a spider wasp eats out the host in which it has been laid. But it's a great success for the fraction of 1% of the population who are the designers of the current system and, not surprisingly, its beneficiaries. Well, by shredding the remnants of political democracy, they also lay the basis for carrying the lethal process forward. And they will continue to do so as long as their victims are willing to suffer in silence and do not follow the inspiring model for which Tahrir Square has become a global symbol.